This is the Olympus 9mm f8 fisheye body cap lens with the model number BCL-0980. It was announced in January 2014 and the lens weighs 30 grams and it has a thickness of 1.28 centimeters. So from this part to the front of the lens there will be 1.28 centimeters which protrudes. It's made out of plastic and it doesn't have a filter thread and there's no lens hood thread neither. It has this built-in cap, so you can move this lever to remove the cap and can put it back that way. This lens is a fully manual focus lens, so it doesn't have any electronics. So if you look on the back, there's no electronics there. So the way to do focus is to use the lever, and it has 3 places for zone focusing. So this is for infinite and some distance in front, which I assume is around 5 meters, and then for close proximity, which is 20 centimeters. So the best thing is to use the zone focusing, but if you really wanted to, you could actually move this lever gradually to try to get the exact focus point which you want. But since the lens is an f8 lens, everything will be in focus anyway, so it doesn't really matter. I typically set it to this distance, which is around, I guess, 5 meters for when I'm recording video. And as I mentioned, the closest focusing distance is 20 centimeters. So the diagonal angle of view is 140 degrees, but this is a fisheye lens, so keep that in mind. So the disadvantages of this lens is that it lacks a focusing ring, so there's no focus ring here, so you just have this lever. So it's quite difficult to get fine-grained control over the focus. But what you can do to overcome that is use focus peaking and punching zoom to focus. And you can also utilize the zone focusing option since this is an f8 lens, so the depth of field will be quite deep. The other disadvantage of this lens is that it's not good in low light situations, simply because it's an f8 lens. But you can somewhat compensate for that by enabling image stabilization, in particular sensor stabilization without the digital stabilization aspect. And you can save a profile for this in the camera. So most of the Olympus cameras allow you to save a profile for a lens where you state the focal length for lenses that don't have electronic contacts. So you can save the lens with a name and its focal length, which is 9mm in this case, so that it can work with the image stabilization and also add that metadata to your images and videos. And one thing which I don't like about fisheye lenses is that they have a strong barrel distortion, but that's just something that comes with the nature of fisheye lenses. So if you enable digital stabilization, the image will have a crop, and some of the strongest part of the image which has that barrel distortion will be cut out. So that's one option if you just want to reduce it slightly and you're doing video recording. If you're taking a photograph, then I guess you can just make the correction in whatever image editing software you're using. The biggest advantages of this lens is that it's really small and light, so it's only 30 grams. So if you wanted to attach this to a camera and have the camera mounted somewhere, it wouldn't add significant amount of weight to the camera, so you can attach it easily with a small micro four third camera to somewhere and, for example, do overhead video recording. So to compare this lens, the closest comparison I think would be to the Olympus M.Zuiko Pro 8mm f1.8 fisheye lens, which is obviously a substantially bigger and heavier lens. So I think it's about 8 centimeters and it weighs 315 grams, which is 10 times heavier than this lens. And its aperture ranges from f1.8 all the way up to f22. And it's obviously significantly more expensive as well. But that's the best lens that you can get, which is a fisheye lens and ultra wide angle. So that might not be a good comparison. Another comparison is the AstrHori 10mm f8 Mark II fisheye lens. So the focal length on that one is 10mm as opposed to 9mm on this one. And it's a similar size, but it is heavier. So the AstrHori one weighs 130 grams, which is 100 grams heavier than this or 4 times heavier than this. And if you're planning to carry a lens which weighs 130 grams, I think there's alternative options that are better. So for example, the best option I think is the Panasonic Lumix 9mm f1.7. So that one also weighs 130 grams, which is 100 grams heavier than this. But that's a proper lens and it has correction for the barrel distortion. So that's a rectilinear lens. It's not rectilinear by the lens element, but the lens profile corrects it to become a rectilinear lens. And the Panasonic Lumix 9mm f1.7 does have electronic contacts and a focus ring and a filter thread and a lens hood thread. So that's, I think, probably the best lens in that range in my opinion. So the Olympus M.Zuiko Pro 8mm f1.8 is also a really good lens, but it's a fisheye lens, whereas personally I prefer rectilinear lenses, and that's why I think the Panasonic Lumix 9mm f1.7 is better, because it's a rectilinear lens. And it's slightly bigger though, so it's 5.2 centimeters as opposed to 1.28 centimeters, which is the case for this lens, but it's still relatively light at 130 grams. So I think that's a good option if you want something rectilinear and relatively small and light and ultra wide angle with a large aperture. Another lens to consider is the Laowa 9mm f2.8, and that lens is rectilinear and it's an f2.8 for aperture, and it's 6 centimeters in thickness or height or whatever you want to call that, this dimension of the lens, but it weighs 215 grams. So that's substantially heavier than this lens and even the Lumix 9mm lens. But nevertheless, that's another micro four third lens with similar characteristic. I mean, it would be much better quality, but I mean, you know, in this kind of focal length and wide angle. Laowa does have a lot of other lenses, but the lenses are typically bigger and heavier, and they mostly have mechanical focus and zoom rings. So that can be good if you want to have repeatable focus pulls when you're recording video. But the lack of electronics means that you have to save the lens profile into the camera and enable it when you use those lenses, as opposed to the camera automatically picking it up, so that the image stabilization can work effectively, and also your images and videos can have the metadata related to that lens. So another lens to consider is the Olympus M.Zuiko 9 to 18mm f4 to f5.6 lens, and that lens is obviously heavier, so it's 155 grams, which is 5 times heavier than the body cap lens, and is bigger as well, particularly when you extend it, since it's a zoom lens. But nevertheless, it does have the 9mm focal length, and that can be used with f4, so substantially brighter image if you wanted that. And the image is higher quality as well, and it's a rectilinear lens. So it does have some barrel distortion, but the barrel distortion is really contained, so that's still considered a rectilinear lens. So that's another option to consider if you're looking at this lens. So another comparison is the body cap of Olympus lenses. So this is not actually a lens, just a body cap which you put on the camera. So let me just show the difference here. So in terms of size, it is obviously a bit shorter. So the body cap itself is 7mm, whereas this one is almost 1.3 centimeters. And in terms of weight, the body cap weighs 9 grams, whereas the 9mm body cap lens weighs 30 grams. So there's a 21 gram difference. So the only reason I'm mentioning this is for you to grasp how small and light this body cap lens is. Another comparison is the Olympus 15mm f8 body cap lens. So that one's a rectilinear lens and obviously has a different focal length to the 9mm, and the 9mm is a fisheye lens. And in terms of size, you can see the slight difference here. So the 15mm is slightly smaller and slightly lighter. So the 15mm is 22 grams if I remember correctly, and this one is 30 grams. And the 15mm has a diagonal angle of view of 72 degrees, whereas with the fisheye lens, the angle of view is 140 degrees. So with the fisheye lens, you will have more in focus simply because it has a bigger angle of view and is a wider lens. And in terms of the size, the 9mm lens is 4mm bigger. So the 15mm lens is 9mm in terms of how much it protrudes once you connect it to the camera. Whereas with the 9mm fisheye lens, it protrudes 1.28 centimeters. So I don't know how visible this is in the video here, but that's the difference. I mean, they're both tiny lenses, both in terms of size and weight. Whereas there are other manufacturers that create body cap lenses, but they seem to be significantly heavier. So this one is 22 grams and the 9mm one is 30 grams. Whereas other equivalent body cap lenses seem to all weigh more than 100 grams, so typically 130 grams in that range. And some of them have a metal construction and some of them might have like a focusing ring. But if you're going up to that weight for a body cap lens, then you might as well look at alternative options that are better, because there exists some. For example, the Panasonic Lumix 9mm f1.7 is one of those, which is relatively light at 130 grams and is relatively small as well, just over 5 centimeters. I haven't spoken much about the quality of this lens, simply because it's a body cap lens, so I don't think the quality really matters that much when you're talking about this type of lenses. So obviously the quality is not great, but since it's a 9mm fisheye lens, which means it has a really wide angle of view, and it's an f8 lens, everything will be in focus anyway. Obviously it will be softer around the corners. Some of that you can get rid of by enabling digital stabilization, and when you're recording video with most of the modern Micro Four Third cameras, they will oversample the video footage anyway, so the video footage quality will be good. But obviously it's not going to compare well if you're comparing it to a proper lens like the 9mm Panasonic Lumix f1.7 lens, or if you compare it to the Olympus M.Zuiko Pro fisheye lens. So I do think it does have its uses. So for example, if you just want to mount the camera somewhere and record something and you're not too concerned about the maximum sharpness of the image, or if you need a really light lens, then this is also a really good option. So you're compromising on the quality a little bit, but you have a substantially lighter and smaller lens. So if you think about it, if you're carrying a few of these lenses, these two lenses together weigh 52 grams and they don't take up any space in a bag. So you could have them in a camera bag just as a backup. So if you really needed a wide angle 9mm lens, then you could pull this out, although a fisheye lens. And this is a 15mm lens as well, which you could have as a backup if something was to happen to the lens that you're using, or you just happen to need that focal length and you don't mind compromising a little bit on the quality without having to carry a big heavy lens with you. Anyway, let me know if you have any questions, or if you want me to compare this lens to another lens in more detail, and I can create a follow-up video for that.